Hey guys, it's Courtney. Today I'm going to be creating a scene with two of the new products from Simon Hurley Create. We're going to be using the Surf's Up stamp set as well as the Wild Waves background stamp. And this is actually 3 pieces, so you can use the whole thing or just one of those pieces. I'm going to be creating a 5x7 card here today because I want to try to fit as much as I can on it. So you can see that I have some masks cut. At this point in the game, I wasn't sure if I was going to create my background with ink blending or whether I was going to color it. Ultimately, I ended up doing both, but I have all of my masks cut. So I usually line those up to kind of get placement, and then I start stamping front to back. So anything that is in front of another needs to be stamped and masked first, and then you can kind of move back from there. I am stamping with Blackout Ink by Ink on 3 because it is a Copic safe ink, and I'm using Simon Says Stamp masking paper for each one of my images. So you can see here that I started by stamping their little bodies. Now there is different heads, which sounds kind of morbid, but there's different heads in this stamp set as well as many of his other stamp sets, and they are interchangeable. So you can certainly take one of the heads or faces from another one of the stamp sets and use that for this stamp set or vice versa. So they all fit perfectly. You do want to make sure that your masks are cut the correct way. So I did have to snip a little bit of her neck off, which really sounds horrible, but I did have to snip a little bit of that off before stamping their little faces. So once those were done, I went ahead and masked those out, and then I am going to go ahead and stamp out her surfboard that I want to kind of be stuck in the sand next to her, and his surfboard he'll obviously be on top of riding the waves. So I'm going to go ahead and stamp those out, but before I stamp out the one that's beside her, I am going to ink that up and then just take my stamp chamois and just wipe off some of the ink that's on the very bottom. And I also take my finger and wipe off any excess moisture that I have on there from my stamp chamois so that that doesn't carry over to my card. Because I want this to be stuck in the sand, you wouldn't necessarily see the very bottom portion of it. So I'm going to go ahead and mask these two out, and then I am going to take my Wild Waves background stamp. And this is where I'm going to kind of create my scene. So I don't necessarily want to stamp this in black because I want to make it a little bit, I want to have it be part of my background. So I'm kind of playing around with which piece I want to use here. I was debating on whether or not to use more than one of the pieces from the stamp set or from the background stamp, but ultimately decided just to use one. Now, because I want this to be part of my background, I'm not going to be stamping this in black. I'm going to be using Fadeout Ink by Ink on 3 because I'm going to just use this as my guide as far as how I should do my coloring and my shading, because I am not artistic enough to draw my own wave or color my own wave without some sort of guidance here. So I did stamp this twice just to make it easier for you guys to see on camera. I can typically see it with just one stamping, or one layer of ink, I guess, but it's just a little bit easier for you guys to see with 2. So for my sand here is where I am going to do a little bit of ink blending. I'm taking some Eclipse masking paper here, and I'm just going to cut pretty much a wavy line here. Just make sure that you don't have any jagged edges because these will definitely show when you do your ink blending. And I'm just going to lay this down and mask off the top portion of my card. I am going to use one of the inks by Simon Hurley. This is called Grrr, and it's like a light brown. It's good for sand. And I'm using one of my blending brushes here, and I'm starting directly on the mask and kind of working my way down. The great thing about the ink blending brushes, and you can certainly use a regular ink blending tool for this too, is you can kind of control the amount of ink you have a little bit easier. So you can see that I'm concentrating darker areas being towards the mask or towards where the ocean would be, and then kind of lightening that up as I go. Now, the Simon Hurley Create inks are dye inks, so you can stamp with them, you can do ink blending with them. So you can get different variations of color with just one ink pad, where if you're using like distress oxides, it is pretty much what it is. It's hard to fade out as much with those, where the dye inks work much better for that. So you can see that I'm just concentrating those darkest areas and then blending that out, getting lighter as it gets closer to us. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that mask as well as all of the others. I like to use the tip of my scissors just to get those started so that I don't tear my paper, especially if you are using masking paper that is very tacky. So we're going to move on to the coloring, and I am starting off with the waves because this is the part that terrifies me the most, and I didn't want to waste my time coloring my images if I wasn't able to achieve the coloring of the waves. So I'm starting off with a very light blue, and I'm not necessarily going to use this color, but I want to kind of map out where my lightest colors are going to be. So the peaks of the waves are going to be the lightest, and where the waves are kind of curved, I guess, the inside of that curve would be the lightest. So next I'm going to go in with the B99, and as you can see, I have this sped up quite a bit because this took me a while. And I am basically just outlining the peaks of the waves. I think they're called peaks of the waves, maybe not. But so those are going to be the darkest areas. So where one wave is in front of another, the wave behind it is going to be a little bit darker. And then underneath that little peak that would normally be pretty much white is going to be a little bit darker as well. And you can see that some of these areas I'm just outlining with this B99, and other areas I'm adding some flicks. And this is just to add a little bit of texture. It's a little bit hard to see on camera, but the wave stamp itself does have these lines already in it, so it can kind of guide you as far as where those flick lines should be if you choose to add them, if you're not comfortable adding your own. So for this little area in between these two waves, there wouldn't necessarily be as much texture. I guess this would be where the water would be a little bit more calm between the two waves. So I am adding my shading with the B99, but I'm not adding any flicks here. You can see here that I brought out the stamp and have that laid out in front of me because I need this as a guide. Because I stamped this with Fadeout ink, I'm starting to lose some of the lines, and I want to make sure that I'm coloring all of the areas the right way. So now I have the B97, which is just one step lighter than the B99, and I'm just extending these areas out a little bit further. I'm adding even more flicks and extending the flicks that I've already created. For this little calm area of the water, I'm just extending those areas out and blending those out a little bit further. Next, I'm going to go on to the B95, and I'm pretty much doing the same thing, guys. It's pretty easy once you have that base layer down, which in this case is the darkest color. That is the part that's going to take you the longest. And you can start to see them come together, but to be honest with you, this looks really terrible. And it will look really terrible. A lot of things that you're going to be coloring are going to look bad before they look good. So don't trash it. Don't get discouraged. Keep going with it. Worst case scenario, it doesn't turn out, at least you learned something. So just keep going with it. I promise you that it will be worth it. Moving on to the B93, just extending those flicks out a little bit further, extending that area out between the two waves a little bit further, and you can see that I'm leaving a very, very small highlight area for the B91. I am going to quickly go over this area or the highlight area with the B91 because I don't want to lose those flick lines. So I don't want to overblend here and lose the texture that I've already created. So once this portion of the waves are done, I want to color in the rest of the ocean where it would be a little bit more calm and in the distance. So I'm taking my T-square ruler here, and I'm going to use the chisel end of my marker just because it's easier to draw a straight line with the chisel nib rather than the brush nib, because trust me, it won't be straight. And I'm using my lightest color here, and this is just for my guide. This will be where the ocean ends and the sky begins. Going to use the same color combinations. I'm going to be using these B90 markers, concentrating the darkest area being the furthest away from us. So I started with that B99, blended that out with the B97, and then I'm also adding some shadows behind this wave that's kind of in the back, the one that he's surfing on. So that would be a little bit darker behind that wave as well, but I don't know whether it would be as dark as the B99. So I just used the darkest mid-tone for that area. I did have to pause a few times and fill some of my markers here because this is a huge area to fill in. So some of them are going a little bit dry. If you notice that you're not getting a good blend and the paper's not getting as saturated as it normally would be, it may be just because your markers need to be refilled. So just keep that in mind. But again, just extending these areas out a little bit further with each of the same colors that I used for the waves. Once the background was done, or once the rest of the ocean, I should say, is done, now I'm going to work on the peaks of the waves. And these would normally be pretty light and have some white areas. But within the image, within the stamped image, there are some lines in there, some squiggly lines, and this would be where there'd be a little bit of shading. So I did go in with my B91 for that little bit of shading. Then I'm going to bring out my white gel pen and I'm going over the little edges of the waves and I'm just adding a little bit of ink, then smearing that out with my finger. So I'm working in small little sections at a time because I don't want to wait for the white gel pen to dry. So as soon as I put that ink down in a small section, I just spread that out with my finger, and this will kind of give you a little bit of a, I guess, wave look. I'm also adding little dots where we would have some spatters of water coming up from the waves. For the sky, I'm just using two colors here. I'm not really too concerned about the sky, but I did add some darkest areas being close to the ocean and then use the lighter color for the top portion. I did have to go over this a few times just so that I didn't have those streaky lines that you sometimes get with alcohol markers. So next, now that I was happy with the waves, I'm okay to go ahead and color out my images. So we're going to start with him first. We're going to start with the skin tones here. And I am always starting off with my lightest color to get the paper saturated and also to map out the darkest areas in case I make a mistake. So I'm not really too concerned about a light source here. So I'm pretty much keeping a center light source for everything. And I am going to add a little bit of shading underneath his hair, where his hair would be hanging over his face. On one side of his nose, that would be hanging over his face as well. Also, he's got some muscles. So I'm going to use those lines that are within the illustration to kind of enhance his little muscles there. So you can see on his arms where it's indented in, I'm adding a little V. Also to his stomach, I'm giving him a little six-pack there. So I'm just extending my lines out just a teeny tiny bit. You can see that I make like a little C line with each one of where his little muscles would be in his stomach. Each time I blend that out, I'm just going to extend those flicks out just a little bit further. So now I'm moving on to the E04 and we're going to just make him really nice and tan. And I'm going to extend these areas out a little bit. You can see that little V that we created on his arm. I just made that a little bit longer and a little bit wider. For the lines that we created on his stomach, I just extended those flicks out just a little bit. Next, I'm going to move on to the E11 and I'm basically doing the same thing, extending those shadow areas out for his face and extending those V's and those little flick lines and those little C lines on his stomach a little bit further. And this will just give a little bit of texture to his skin rather than just having flat belly. And then next I'm going to move on, or finally I'm going to move back to that lightest color that we had started with, and I'm just going to go ahead and add all of my highlight areas, which is basically going to be the top of his arms, the bottom portion of his face, and the middle portion of his belly. I did forget to add that E11 on his legs, so I did have to bring that back out and extend that E04 a little bit before going back in with that lightest color. For her, I'm going to switch over with a different color combination for her skin, but I am starting off with that lightest color to map out those darkest areas. Then moving on to the darkest color, the two midtones, then back to the lightest color. For her shading, it's going to be underneath her hair, where her hair is hanging over her face a little bit, on the inside of her little arms, underneath her chin, also where her bathing suit would cast a shadow on her chest, and her legs are crossed. So these would also create a shadow. So where her legs are bent, that is going to be a shadow. And where one leg is behind another, that would also create a shadow. Also adding a little bit of shading to the bottom portion of her legs, or I guess it would be one side of her legs, but what's closest to the ground, I should say. So my E04 is my darkest color for her, and this is kind of my go-to combination for skin. I use this one quite often. Going to go ahead and blend that out with the E11. Now you can see they have little white parts of their eyes. I'm coloring right over them at this point because I just don't feel like going around them. You can certainly go around them, but I will, once I finish my coloring, once I go in with my white gel pen to add some more details, I'll just color in the whites of their eyes again so that they'll be white again. So next, blending this out with the lightest midtone here, just extending those areas out a little bit further. And you can see that I'm left with a pretty small highlight for her arms and legs, and I'm okay with that. We have a pretty large highlight on her face towards her chin. And I wanted to add a little bit of color to her cheeks. So I'm going to bring out an R20 marker, and I'm just going to add some color to both of her cheeks. Then very, very quickly go back in with that E50, which is that lightest color, and blend that out so it doesn't stand out too much. So next, moving on to hair, I'm going to start with him, and I'm going to be using my E50 markers. Now his hair is kind of parted off to the side. He's also got some wavy hair that's falling behind him, and he's kind of got some hair hanging in front of his ears. So I'm going to be using some flicking motions here. I'm going to add my darkest areas where his hair is parted, and then where it's kind of tucked behind his ears a little bit, and also where it's hanging behind his face, or behind his head, I guess would be the darkest as well. I am using just the tip of my marker. You can see that my marker is pretty much straight up and down, and that's the best way to get that flick or that feathering look that you're going for, especially with hair. Have that marker straight up and down and barely touch that tip to the paper. I'm using such a light hand, especially with my darkest color, that sometimes I totally miss the paper. So, and that's okay too. Sometimes my marker kind of skips because I'm adding such little pressure. So I extended that out with the E57 and then finished off with the E55 for that highlight color. Moving on to her hair, I want her to appear as a blonde. So I'm using an E15, which is obviously brown, but I'm using this just as my shadow color. So again, using that her part in her hair as the darkest area, also where her hair would be tucked behind her ears and falling behind her face would also cast a shadow there. Again, using my flicking motions with just the tip of my marker. And when I move on to the darkest midtone, which is the Y26, I'm going directly over the E15 because I want to kind of lighten it up a little bit. Not necessarily lighten it up, but make it a little bit more golden color. And I just didn't have the right color for that. So if you don't, you can always kind of make your own by just going over one color with another. So I'm just extending these flicks out. You will also notice that my flick lines are in the same shape as her hair. So where her hair is kind of rounded on top of her head, my flick lines are also more rounded. So you just want to go with the shape of whatever object you are coloring, and this will give you a more realistic look as well. I did bring in the Y21 for just the highlight for the bottom portion of her hair, and quickly, very quickly, went over the top portion so that I didn't move around that dark color too much. For her bathing suit, I'm going to bring in some RV markers, again starting with that lightest color, adding a little bit of shading to either side of her bathing suit, and also adding a little bit of shape to her body as well. And in the middle of her bathing suit on the top, it's kind of dipped in a little bit. So you'll see that I'll go back with the RV25, which is my darkest midtone, once my coloring is complete for her bathing suit, and just add a little bit of a shape there. It's kind of like a sweetheart neckline, I guess you could call it. And so I wanted to keep that shape, and by just adding a little bit of shading there, it really helps. So next, moving on to his bathing suit here, I'm going to use some YG markers using the G28 as my shadow color, or that scary dark color, and just adding a little bit to the inside of his legs there, blending that out with the YG17 and then the YG, what did I use? The YG23, I think it was. And then finishing it off with that highlight color again that we had started with. Next, for the surfboard, her surfboard, I'm going to switch over to some purples, violets. Starting off with that lightest color, which I probably should have colored the entire thing or covered the entire thing and really got that paper saturated because I wasn't getting the best blend here. This is a normal combination that I use often, but for some reason they just weren't working well for me today. But we'll fix that in the end. Going to add a little bit of shading to either side of the surfboard, a little bit more to the left-hand side because it's kind of tilted a little bit. So that side would be just a little bit darker than the other. Blending that out with the V06 and V04 and just leaving a center highlight, but a little bit off to the right-hand side for that V01. You can see that I just wasn't getting a good blend, but no worries, we can cover that up. So for his surfboard, I want this to be yellow. So I'm going to start off again with that lightest color to get the paper saturated. Now the shading for this, I originally put some shadows underneath his feet and I was going to do the shading in the front, but I decided to add the shading to the back of the surfboard. So bringing in that E99 for the darkest color, and this is clearly brown, but whenever you're doing shading with yellow, it's your best to shade with either a brown or an orange, and that way you'll get that contrast. If you just stick to Y markers, you may have a hard time getting the contrast you're looking for. So blending those areas out each time with each of the Y markers, including that little shadow that is underneath his feet, keeping the front part of that surfboard for that highlight, that Y04 color. Now for the little beach ball here, I'm pretty much using the same color combinations as I've used throughout the entire card. So I'm not going to show you this entire thing, but I am going to show you just where I put the shading. Because this is such a little area, I am going directly in with my darkest color, adding some shading to each little section to the front and the back, I guess, or bottom and top, and then just leaving the middle being the highlight. And this will kind of give it more of a round appearance. And like I said, I just use the same color combinations as I've used already in the card, so no need to see that again. For the middle, I guess it wouldn't be a middle, but I wanted to add a little bit of shading to this little circle here, so I just used a C3 and a C1 just to add a little bit of shading. Next, going to bring in some E30 markers, and I'm just going to add some shadows. So I'm using little dots where her surfboard would be stuck in the sand. And I was going to use dots for the other shadows too, but ultimately decided just to add a regular shadow to underneath her and underneath that beach ball, and kept the little dots for where I guess the sand would be a little bit piled up, I guess you could say, where the surfboard is sticking in. Blended that out with the E35, E33, and then I'm going to finish off with that E31, and I'm just adding my dots. I'm just extending the dots out underneath the surfboard a little bit further the lighter I get, but I'm going directly over the dark dots with the light dots, if that makes sense. And this will kind of just give it a little bit more texture. So next we are going to fill in some areas with a white gel pen. So I'm going to add the whites back into their eyes that we have already covered up with our coloring. And then I'm going to add some reflections to the ball, and this will give it even more of a round appearance. Also added some random highlights to her bathing suit and his surfboard. Also added a little bit more texture to the back of the water. And again, just smearing that with my finger, and this will just give it a little bit of a, I don't know, like a spray, I guess you could say, from the ocean. Next, I was still hating the coloring of this surfboard, so I'm going to add stripes to it. And this will kind of disguise the fact that my coloring job was pretty terrible. So once I got to the white gel pen, I have a little visitor here that kind of disturbed everything just a little bit here. So I'm going to lose focus here and there a little bit because Frankie decided to join us. It's getting pretty cold out, so he's losing his window, or at least I refuse to keep it open all day because it's 50 degrees out. But I'm going to just finish off with the white highlights and their little tongues with the R22, and then finished off with the sentiment using scrapbook.com hybrid black ink. And this is the sentiment from the Surfs Up stamp set. And that's it, guys. That's it for the card. I will leave all the supplies listed below. Thank you guys so much for stopping by, and have a great day. Bye.